Evening. Lecture 7, Anatomy of Thorax. Objectives of our lecture: to identify the skeleton of the heart, the SA and AV node, in addition to the AV bundle, which is the conducting system of the heart. Third is the blood supply and collateral circulation of the heart. The structure of the heart, as you know, the two arteria are separated from each other by interarterial septum. The two ventricles are separated by interventricular septum. The upper part of the interventricular septum is thin and membranous, and it has an attachment with the fibrous skeleton, only the membranous part, but not the muscular part. So the membranous part has attachment to the skeleton of the heart. The lower part of the septum is muscular. It is thicker and muscular. The position of the septum is indicated on the surface of the heart by the anterior and posterior interventricular grooves. And as you know, the heart consists of three layers. The outer or external layer is the epicardium, the middle one is the myocardium, and the inner one is the endocardium. What is the skeleton of the heart? The skeleton of the heart consists of four fibrous rings. Right atrioventricular, one is surrounding the right atrioventricular surface, around the left atrioventricular surface, around the pulmonary orifice and aortic orifice. So the four fibrous rings surrounding the four orifices: the right atrioventricular, left atrioventricular orifices, pulmonary orifice, and aortic orifice. In addition, as I said, the membranous part, which is the upper part of the ventricular septum, has an attachment to the skeleton of the heart. So the function of the skeleton of the heart is to support the heart, supporting the bases of the valves. If you remember in the previous lectures, we said that the bases of the valves of the heart, three of these four valves, the bases are attached to the fibrous skeleton, to the skeleton of the heart, to prevent them from stretching and incompetence. What about the conducting system of the heart? Normally, the heart contracted rhythmically about 70 to 90 beats per minute in adult at rest. الشخص البالغ يكون at rest, not at exercise, because in exercise these numbers will be different. But at rest, it is 70 up to 90 is considered to be normal. The impulses will be initiated in the conducting system of the heart, initiated and conducted in the conducting system of the heart. What is the conducting system of the heart? It consists of specialized cardiac muscle fibers. It is started in the SA node. It consists of SA node, you see in this slide, AV node, أو نسميها atrioventricular node, و atrioventricular bundle, then right bundle branch and left bundle branch, and finally the subendocardial plexus of specialized cardiac muscle fibers named as Purkinje fibers. إذا the conducting system of the heart هو هذا اللي ياخذ ال green color in your slide. ال SA node, ال Sinoaterial node, والatrioventricular node, atrioventricular bundle, right bundle branch, left bundle branch, and Purkinje fibers which is subendocardial plexus نسميه لأن تمشي تحت الاندوكارديوم. The sinoaterial node, as you see in this slide, it is located on the anterior wall of the right atrium, at the upper part of sulcus terminalis, just to the right of the opening of the superior vena cava. This is the site of initiation of impulse. Okay? So it is on the anterior wall of the right atrium, at the upper part of sulcus terminalis, just to the right side of the opening of the superior vena cava. So here the initiation of impulses is started, and then it will spread throughout the wall of the atrium, causing contraction of the atrium. So the atrium will be contracted first. Then the AV node. The AV node, this is the second node that you see on this slide. The AV node, where is the location of this or the site of this node? It is located on the lower part of the atrial septum, at the lower part of the atrial septum, just to the left side of the opening of the coronary venous sinus. So here the impulse comes from SA node to the AV node, to the atrioventricular node. Then from the atrioventricular node to the atrioventricular bundle to be distributed to the ventricles, causing contraction of the ventricles. The atrioventricular bundle, or another name is bundle of His. This is the only route along which the cardiac impulses can travel from the atria to the ventricles. لازم هو هذا الطريق الوحيد in order that the heart can contract it normally. Through the impulses should be travel from the AV node to the AV bundle. This is the only route that the cardiac impulses comes from the atria to the ventricles. Then here this bundle, it descends shortly in the membranous part of the ventricular septum, يعني بالupper part. As you see in this slide, shortly descend in the membranous part, then it will be divided into two branches, in the muscular part, intermuscular part, and it divided into two branches, the right bundle branch to the right side and the left bundle branch which is to the left side. The right bundle branch, you remember when we talk about the right ventricle or when we talk about the moderator band, here the right bundle branch, we said that it enter in the moderator band in the right ventricle, and it supplied the anterior wall of the ventricles. It reached to the anterior wall of the ventricles, then دائما ينتهي breaks into Purkinje fibers to supply all parts of the right ventricle. In the right bundle branch, it passes enter to the right ventricle in the moderator band supplied by muscle fiber نسميها moderator band. يمشي بالmoderator band supply the wall of the ventricle, then it breaks into Purkinje fibers اللي هي specialized cardiac muscle fibers supply the right ventricle. Then the left bundle branch, it pierces the septum, it passes down beneath the endocardium. The left bundle divided into two branches, the left side anterior and posterior branch. ونفس الشيء also supply the wall of the ventricle, the left ventricle, the bases of the papillary muscle, and breaks into Purkinje fiber. إذا the right side يدخل بالمودريتر band supplying the ventricle وبعدين supplying the ventricle والwall of the ventricle والpapillary muscle أيضا. And in the left side it will runs enter to the left ventricle divided into anterior and posterior branch, and also to the supply the papillary muscles and the breaks into Purkinje fibers supplying the left ventricle. So the conduction system of the heart, it is not only responsible for generation of impulse, generation of normal rhythmic impulses, but also it is responsible for conduction of these impulses rapidly and efficiently to maintain normal and rhythmic cardiac contraction. And also this drawing showing the SA node, the AV node, the right bundle branch, the left bundle branch, and these are the Purkinje fibers. Here, the Purkinje fibers are very clear in this drawing. Arterial supply of the heart. As you know, the heart is supplied by right and left coronaries. We have the right coronary artery and left coronary artery. They arise from the ascending aorta, and they runs in the subepicardial tissue, within the subepicardial connective tissue. So, the right coronary artery. The right coronary artery, it arises from the anterior aortic sinus. It runs forward between the pulmonary trunk and right auricle. It descends, as you see in this slide, it descends vertically in the right atrioventricular groove to the ينزل downward إلى الانفerior border of the heart. بعدين posteriorly along the atrioventricular groove to make anastomosis with the left coronary artery in the posterior interventricular groove. يمشي بالposterior interventricular groove as posterior interventricular artery. يعني يعمل anastomosis بالposterior interventricular groove. So supply طبعا الرايت atrium, right ventricle, part of the left atrium or left ventricle, in addition to the septum also. What are the branches of the right coronary artery? First is right conus artery. Right conus artery يعني supply the pulmonary conus اللي هي منطقة الانفundibulum of right ventricle. If you remember, we mentioned this region in previous lectures. It supplies the pulmonary conus أو الانfundibulum of right ventricle and upper part of the anterior wall of right ventricle. Right conus artery. Next is the anterior ventricular branches. يعطي anterior ventricular branches، يعطي posterior ventricular branches. زين ال anterior ventricular branches, they are maybe two or three in number. They supply the right ventricle. طبعا ال anterior part of the right ventricle أو anterior surface of the right ventricle. زين أكو عندنا marginal branch. This is the largest. هو من اسمه marginal. It runs along the margin of the anterior surface downward to reach the apex. إذا عندنا anterior ventricular branches 2 or 3 in number supply من اسمه ventricular supply the anterior surface of the ventricle. وعندنا marginal branch supply the lower margin of the anterior surface. وعندنا posterior ventricular branches, they are 2 in number, supply diaphragmatic surface of the ventricle, of the right ventricle. Posterior ventricular branches. وعندنا أهم واحد is the posterior interventricular artery أو اللي هو descending artery. It runs in the posterior interventricular groove. زين ايش راح يعطي؟ It gives branches يمشي بالposterior interventricular groove وراح يعطي branches to the right and left ventricles. وحتى supply the posterior part of the ventricular septum but not the apical part. The posterior part it supply قلنا right to left ventricles and it supply the posterior part of the ventricular septum but not the apical part. ليش؟ لأن ال apical part is supplied by the anterior interventricular branch that comes from the left coronary artery. زين أكو بعد عندنا branch اسمه large septal branch. من اسمه septal to the septum supplying the AV node, runs to the septum supplying AV node. What else؟ يعطي أيضا atrial branches، يعطي في anterior و posterior ventricular branches ويعطي atrial branches supply the atrium supplying the anterior surface of right atrium وال posterior of the right both right and left atria atrial branches ويعطي artery of SA node artery of SA node supply the SA node طبعا in 35% of individuals this artery of SA node arises from the left coronary artery يعني معظم الحالات arises from the SA node from right coronary but sometimes in 35% of population it arises from the left coronary artery. The left coronary artery. Left coronary artery is larger than the right coronary artery. It is larger and supplies the major part of the heart, the major part of the left atrium, left ventricle, and even the septum, the ventricular septum. The origin from left posterior aortic sinus. The left coronary artery arises from left posterior aortic sinus. It runs forward. الرايت side يمشي بين البلمونري trunk والرايت auricle. هذا الليفت coronary يمشي it runs between pulmonary trunk and left auricle. When enter to the atrioventricular groove and it divided into anterior interventricular branch and circumflex branch. anterior interventricular و circumflex. زين هسه إذا نيجي نناقش البرانشز. What are the branches of the left coronary artery? First anterior interventricular artery أو اللي هو descending branch. anterior interventricular artery it descends in the anterior interventricular groove. Descend anteriorly in the anterior interventricular groove downward toward the apex of the heart. In most of the cases, بمعظم الحالات, it runs around the apex, يفتر حوالين الأبيكس. Then it enter to the posterior interventricular groove and make anastomosis there with the branches from the coronary artery. هاي بمعظم الحالات يفتر حوالين الابيكس اوف ذا هارت ويدخل بالبوستيريور انترفنتريكولار جروف ويعمل هناك انستموسيس مع التيرمينال برانشز اللي جاي من الرايت كوروناري ارتري. But in 1/3 of population it ends at the apex of the heart. In 1/3 of population of individuals it ends ينتهي at the apex of the heart. زين من اسمه anterior interventricular branch, so it supplied the ventricles, supplies the right ventricle, the left ventricle, the anterior side of the right and left ventricles, and even the ventricular septum, of course. One of these ventricular branches اللي تطلع من anterior interventricular branch supply the ventricles. أكو واحد اسمه left diagonal artery. Left diagonal artery, it arises directly from the trunk. اسمه left diagonal artery. In addition أكو small left conus artery to supply the pulmonary conus. مثل بالرايت سايد أكو conal، هون هم عندنا أكو conus supply the pulmonary conus. Second branch is circumflex artery. من اسمه circumflex يعني يفتر. Circumflex artery, this is the same size as the anterior interventricular artery. The same size, it winds يعني يفتر. It winds around the margin of the heart in the atrioventricular groove. يفتر left margin يعني يرجع يفتر ويرجع around the left margin of the heart in the atrioventricular groove. المارجنال أكو عندنا left marginal artery. It is large branch. من اسمه left marginal supply the left margin of the left ventricle, of course. Left marginal. Anterior ventricular branches. أكو posterior ventricular branches. More arterial branches. All these arises from the left coronary artery. مثل الرايت coronary ما يعطي anterior ventricular و posterior ventricular و arterial. نفس الشيء. left coronary artery أيضا راح يعطي anterior ventricular و posterior ventricular branches و arterial branches. What is the collateral circulation of the heart? The terminal branches of the right and left coronaries, they anastomosis between each other. There is anastomosis here between the terminal branches of the two coronaries in the heart, which is very good. This is very good and beneficial. But unfortunately, sometimes they are not large enough to provide adequate blood supply. يعني sometimes إنه إذا صار في blockage in large artery يعني الانستموسيس تكون في fine circulation, هي collateral circulation, but it is not that large enough حتى تمنع حدوث الانفاركشن خلينا نقول أو death, الميوكارديال death اللي هو death of the cardiac muscle in the myocardium layer. So the sudden block إذا كان large branch of right coronary artery أو left coronary artery, this will lead to damage or death, necrosis in the myocardial fibers أو in the myocardial layer. sometimes إذا كان blockage, if it is fine and يعني fine أقصد إنه minimum أو بسيط أو فد شيء ممكن collateral circulation تعوض. لكن if the blockage was affecting large artery or large vessel here, so it can lead to myocardial death. والcollateral circulation ممكن ما تعوض. ممكن تعوض إذا كان الدمج بسيط وخفيف جدا، بس إذا كان الدمج أو البلوكج الانسداد is big فما تلحق. يعني collateral circulation cannot do this. And thank you for today.